Okay, so let's figure out the causes of European exploration. Prince Henry, he wanted to send ships to Africa to get the goods that were already coming to Europe through the Silk Road. He believed that if ships sailed around the coast of Africa, they could get the goods, same goods to Europe quicker and cheaper. That way there's more of a profit and Portugal would increase in power. So what he does, Prince Henry, is he creates these navigation schools that had better ships built and schooled the sailors in navigation techniques. Astrolabe was used for sailing along the West African coast. So this sets up Portugal to be a world leader in trade and encourages the rest of Europe to send their own ships and find their own routes to Asia. And this is what leads to the discovery by Europe, or of Europe, the discovery of Europeans about the Americas. Okay. Unfortunately, on the downside, this also leads to the slave trade because of the West African connection. But this is all because of the entrepreneurship of Prince Henry. He kind of started a new thing going on. Now, the empires will look like this. Okay. You can see that yellow is the Spanish Empire, blue is the French Empire, green is the Portuguese Empire, and red is the British Empire. Okay, this is very important. You're going to notice that these raw materials that they find in these places creates later on a very intense competition. So we'll see where that goes. All right, now, one of the places that the Europeans land, specifically the British, is Australia. Okay. Now, the first people, not the first colonists, the first people in Australia were the Aborigines, the indigenous people there. They were hunter-gatherers. They came from Southeast Asia. They settled in the land that we have located and we call Australia. Their religion is called Dreamtime, and they lived on the coast. They loved it there. It was the best climate, the best places for living. And they worshipped Ayers Rock, Uluru, as a holy place, of course, and then came the Europeans. Okay, when the Europeans came, you've got to keep in mind that they had just lost the American colonies. Georgia, the state of Georgia itself, was a prison colony to begin with. Well, that's gone now. They don't get to use that, and their prisons are still overcrowded. So they needed a new place to send people from those prisons. Remember, in those days, you could get sent to prison for stealing a loaf of bread. So they were very crowded. So Captain James Cook, he stumbles upon that continent of Australia and started setting it up as a penal colony. So the first colonists in Australia were prisoners, convicts. Eventually, though, more and more people, more missionaries come and to live there. But all the good spots were taken by the indigenous people, the Aborigines. So the indigenous people, those Aborigines, where they lived along the coast, had to go. And so the British didn't care about them at all. They thought they were primitive. They didn't think they had anything to offer the British settlers, which was not true at all. Okay, they didn't have anything they wanted except for their land. So fighting wars where the Aborigines were hopelessly outmatched. The British pushed them inland, pushed the Aborigines inland to that desert climate of Australia. The bad part also, along with the already bad parts, is that the Aborigines' immune systems, they could not fight off the diseases that the Europeans were carrying. You're talking smallpox, measles, influenza. So thousands of Aborigines died because they couldn't fight off those diseases. So the indigenous population today in Australia is only about 2% of the population. Now, this sets up a thing about Columbian exchange, especially with all this exploration. They're finding these new crops. They're bringing them back. They're taking these crops from the old world to the new world. So literally, we would explain the Columbian exchange as the trade of crops, resources, people, culture, and germs from the old world, which would be Europe, to the new world, which would be North and South America. Okay, crops were traded back and forth. It creates a food surplus, so population explosion in Europe, and it creates a huge market for those goods. So they're like, we can make some money. Yeah. So the large crops were set up, and these large plantations were created to make these cash crops. And initially, the Europeans used the indigenous people as slaves. However, just like in Australia, the Europeans did not treat the natives very well, and competition was building to make the most money based on these plantations in Latin America. The natives that ran the plantations, they had problems. They were dying off because of the same diseases that they had no immunity to. Just like in Australia, smallpox, measles, influenza, like the Aborigines had there. They would fight the the English, the Europeans, the French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese. They would fight these guys off, or they would just like pop off the plantations, mingle back with the other indigenous populations because they couldn't tell one indigenous person from the next, and then they would fight them again. So something needed to be done, and that's when the Europeans remembered that slaves were being traded in Africa, and when Portugal was initially exploring the west coast of Africa. So this happened before the Americans were discovered. This is where at least the slave trade. Okay, so this horrible period of history begins when the Africans, they didn't have any problem with the diseases that the Europeans had. They'd already had centuries worth of contact with them. So African immunity to the English diseases, to the French, to the Portuguese, to the Spanish, to the German, they were already immune. So that wasn't an issue. In addition to that, slaves couldn't exactly escape the plantation and blend in with the regular population because they looked different. So slavery that lasted until most Latin Americans became independent. It's like 300 years. The Africans were brutally used as slaves and used for their labor in the New World. So make no mistake, it's because of these efforts by the slaves from Africa that the New World was successful and economically profitable. And today, many of the people that live in Latin America have ancestors from Africa. You can see parts of West African culture now, even when you visit different parts of Latin America. Brazil, Cuba, there's in the language, religion, culture. Other things that happened because of the Columbian exchange was the impact of the horse. Now, before the Europeans brought over the horse from Europe to North and South America, to the New World, the horse didn't exist in the Columbian exchange. There are 4 things that you need to know that the horse did. First, travel. People could move farther and faster. Trade, because travel increases, trade did too. Not only did they have their old partners that they could trade with real fast, but they were getting new partners also. Now, work. Horses are a beast of burden, so the horse increased productivity on plantations. They could do a lot of heavy. They didn't get tired as easy and all that. And so war and fighting on horseback, are you kidding me? It really kills your enemies better and faster with less chance of you getting killed. So that really helps. All this goes on in the Columbian exchange, and what happens is the ethnic groups that are there start to blend. So the 3 main blends, though, that you need to think about are the Africans, the Europeans, and the indigenous people. So like a mestizo, that is a blend of like a European and indigenous person. A mulatto would be a blend of like an African and a European. So again, the languages, the religions, and other aspects of the culture became something unique to Latin America, especially the different parts of Latin America. And eventually those that lived in Latin America became tired of all the Europeans telling them what to do and how to live and blah, blah, blah. And so they were tired of being slaves. And the slaves were tired of being slaves. So here's the following people that really helped free Latin America. The first is a guy named Toussaint Louverture. He's like the original gangster. Toussaint. All right? So he's a former slave that became literate and read a whole bunch of books and made him decide that slavery was a really, really bad thing. This is during the Enlightenment. He led a revolt against the French in Saint Domingue, which is what we call Haiti now, and freed the slaves on the island. He proclaimed himself king, but he got Napoleon mad, and so he was captured and he died in prison. But even though he didn't really live to see it, Haiti was free because of his independence that he started fighting for from France. He started that, so Toussaint Louverture's slave revolt, amazing. Father Miguel Hidalgo. Dolores, that was the shout, that cry of Dolores for Mexicans to revolt against the Spanish. And even though he didn't live to see it, his speech, the cry of Dolores speech, inspired Mexicans to fight for that independence from Spain, and they eventually got it. Last guy that we're going to talk about, big independence guy, was Simón Bolívar. This guy, right? He was a revolutionary leader. He freed all sorts of countries from Spanish rule. He was so loved and powerful in Latin America that he was known as the George Washington of South America, and sometimes they'd call him Simón Bolívar, the liberator. Right? So he freed countries like Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. He took all of these territories and made it his own dictatorship, unitary autocracy, all right? And he called it Grand Colombia. And, he ran it. So all this goes on, but then the Latin American countries get their freedom. So now Europe's in a pickle. They need all these resources, so now they have to turn to Asia and Africa. Well, less land means more competition. This is where we get our mania, our militarism. Okay, they're building up their armed forces to protect their overseas lands, alliances. Hey, you got my back because these guys are kind of crazy. And they were doing the same thing. They're acting really crazy. I need you to help me out. And so all these alliances held up. Nationalism. We've seen it with Australia. We've seen it with Latin America. The Europeans, they didn't think anybody else had anything to offer them. But moreover, they thought that their own culture in Europe was the best. So the Germans loved German, all things German. Didn't think the French, really the French, or anybody else had anything to offer. The British, again, the British thought they were the best. They were the best European culture. So you see it even so in Europe, that clash. It's for nationalism. And imperialism is where they went out and they took the lands. Oh, this is yours? No. Now this is ours. Okay, and then they would have that competition more and more, building in Europe and in Africa and Asia, where they would take these lands. Okay, and it all comes to a head because Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke, okay, from Austria-Hungary, gets assassinated. Okay, and when that happens, this guy starts declaring war on this guy, and they call their buddies, who call on their buddies, and all of a sudden, boom, you have a world war, which is focused mainly in Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. The Allies win, okay, but it changes the map of Europe completely. You should thank them because there were many more countries that you would have had to memorize otherwise. And some countries completely disappeared and was absorbed by others, and some were renamed. So Canada, after World War I, was like, listen, they said this to Great Britain, you took all of our soldiers that we had to fight in your World War I, they all died. Not all of them, but a good many of them died. And Canada shouldn't even been involved in World War I. Okay, it's just like we need some time apart. Okay, and so what happens then is Great Britain, through bit by bit, lets Canada become more and more independent. This was the final straw. This was the final break. Okay, and Canada was completely, totally independent. The only link between the United Kingdom and Canada is one. The Queen of England, right? She's that monarch. She's that head of state. Doesn't really do anything. And two, Canada is a member of the British Commonwealth of Nations. So it's basically a trade agreement, reducing trade barriers and all that kind of stuff that I know you know about. Okay. So some developments following World War I. You had the Treaty of Versailles. Okay. So during World War I, Germany was really good at fighting that war. They were really, really good. And they started winning a lot. And then all of a sudden they didn't start winning a lot. And they started losing a lot. So much so that by the end of it, everybody was so angry at Germany for all the destruction that they had caused in Europe from beating everybody down. But part of the Treaty of Versailles was they went for blood, remember. Okay, they had these provisions. Germany had to accept blame for the war. They had to pay these war reparations, the war debt. They pay that back. They give up territory and no more armies, ever. And this was what the Treaty of Versailles said. Well, that set up a whole chain of events that made things worse, obviously. It's revenge. It doesn't ever pay off. Okay, so Germany tries to pay off the massive war debt by printing up more money. That's pretty stupid, okay? Don't ever do that. Don't ever let your economy do that because that causes hyperinflation. So the value of the German mark, okay, becomes smaller and smaller because they're printing up more and more money. All right? So much so that you actually had to have a wheelbarrow to buy a loaf of bread. It was cheaper to burn money in the furnace than to try to use that money to buy coal. You get more bang for your buck just to burn it. So Germany's economy fails. Okay, the rest of Germany was relying, the rest of Europe was relying on Germany to bail them out. Well, Germany couldn't do it. So then they fall. And so when Europe falls, everybody falls. Okay? And so it sets off a chain reaction, spreads throughout the world. Okay? And that helps the Nazis come into party. Okay? The Nazis come into power because of this. Adolf Hitler comes and he says, listen, life sucks. It's horrible. I can make it better. Me and the Nazis, we got your back. He said he promised to end the hard times. He was going to restore Germany's power before World War I ended. He blames the Jews for all the bad stuff that's happening. Okay, and he promised to ignore the Treaty of Versailles. And he follows through on everything he says. Okay, and starts World War II. World War II is fought. World War II is ended. Germany and the Axis powers that were there, they did well at the start, but then again, just like World War I, Germany loses. History repeating itself. Okay, and so what Hitler does is he loses. Okay, Germany's done. What happens though is now Europe is just done. It's just too much fighting, too short of a span of time. All their resources are burning up. Now all their colonies are gone. No more imperialism, no more colonies, nothing. Everybody's becoming independent and they have to fend for themselves. So Europe doesn't have any country in it that has any kind of power, which leaves two countries that kind of rise up. Okay? While we're rising up, while we're talking about those countries, one of the things that we found out about was that Hitler, because he blamed the Jews, actually punished the Jews by systematically murdering 6 million Jews. It's called the Holocaust. Okay, and Nazi Germany happens during this time, the 30s and the 40s, and all these Jews were killed. Okay, remember we felt so bad about it afterwards that we actually took some land from the Middle East, created the state of Israel, so that the Jews, people who practice Judaism, have some place to go for safety. While this is going on, two countries kind of like come out. It's the communist command economy of the Soviet Union starts rising up, and then the capitalist market economy of the United States. Okay, they start arguing. United States versus the Soviet Union. Now, the United States has some friends in like Great Britain and Germany. They're not as powerful. They kind of do what the United States wants because we have all the economic power now. But they argue so much with the Soviet Union, they actually split Germany. Okay, because they took that territory of Germany, so Germany would kind of like have no power. And they even split Berlin. So now you have a communist East and a capitalist West. And that sets up the stage for a lot of stuff. Okay, so the Soviet Union was a command economy, practiced communism. Their ideas clash completely with the United States. And that's a market economy that practices capitalism, entrepreneurship all the way. But it was a Cold War, so that means they never went to an actual war, no actual battlefield with guns firing on it. Okay, we've had other ways to kind of steal that away. Now, a good way I always like to remember it, as I like to look at what happened if Superman landed in the Soviet Union versus what we know as Superman in the United States. Okay, so it gets a little crazy. Here we have truth, justice, in the American way. Here we have like the power of the proletariat, all right, the working class. Okay, so different ideals. While the superpowers are rising, Cuba has a revolution. Cuba was a democracy. The United States was all up in Cuba. We had businesses everywhere. Okay, and then there was a vote. Two leaders went up. This was Fidel Castro and Fulgencio Batista. Okay, Castro wins. Yay! But wait, Batista, he was not happy with that. So he actually took over the country with military force, kicked out Castro. Castro's like, okay, Lucy. And then Castro goes and he starts guerrilla warfare against Batista. And then over the course of time, eventually throws out Batista, kicks him out of the country. Okay, kills off all of his generals that stayed behind. Like, it was like brutal. Okay, like Colosseum Roman style, gladiator stuff. All right. United States was like a little sketchy about this. And then what Castro does is Castro turns to communism, and destroys all American ownership in Cuba. It says this now belongs to the government of Cuba. You don't own it, American entrepreneurs, which really made us mad. So you see some clashes there, right? And so we start really going after Castro. We start sending people to assassinate him and kill him and all kinds of things. And he turns to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's like, yeah, we'll help you out. Listen, we've got these missiles that we'd like to put on your island, and we'd like to, they're kind of nuclear. We'd like to do that. And, Castro, he needs a friend. They want to do this. We're like, okay. And then we have these spy satellites that are orbiting Cuba, and we're like, look, and say, hey, that looks like a missile. That's not cool. And so what ends up happening is with the Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy from the United States and Nikita Khrushchev from the Soviet Union kind of have this deadlock. Like we have missiles in Turkey that are pointed at the Soviet Union, and they didn't like that, so they put missiles in Cuba pointed at us. And Cuba's only 90 miles away, so we were really, really sweating. It was tough. And basically, long story short, even though we didn't still play nice, we agreed we would take our missiles out of Turkey if Russia took their missiles out of Cuba, which they did, and everybody kind of played nice, and we didn't die a nuclear holocaust, so that was nice. Well, that happened in the 1960s. Skip ahead 20 years, okay? 20 years later, United States and the Soviet Union reach a détente. It's basically, we're going to build down our military to fight. We're not going to fight you as much. We're not going to build up an army to like show you. Remember like Mania from World War I? Well, we were kind of learning our lesson. We're going to build that army down if they do it, and they did too. So we started working together. But in the Soviet Union, countries that were part of that Soviet Union started revolting against Russia. That was the center of the Soviet Union, and it was too expensive to keep fighting them and to keep fighting us. Basically, what happens is because of economy, communism falls. Okay, the Berlin Wall comes down. That's the symbolic end of the Cold War. Germany reunites, and it feels so good. And so good, in fact, that Germany has like one of the best economies in the world today, especially in the European Union, which it's a part of. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about, in the 90s, we started a trade agreement. The United States starts a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, the three of us. It's called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And everybody was so happy because we're going to get rid of the trade barriers, the economy's going to boom. Some people were not so happy about it. One of the groups that were not happy about it were the Zapatistas. Now, these were indigenous people that were very terrified that, the crops that were grown in the United States would be like so cheap there, everybody's going to buy those, and those indigenous people in southern Mexico and Chiapas, they would grow all these crops. It would be too expensive, and so nobody would buy their crops because it cost too much. It was way cheaper in the United States. Okay, and so the Zapatistas were so angry about it, they go to these towns, they take them over, they invade these towns, they take over these towns, and they say, listen, we have some demands. And so after some negotiations with the indigenous Mexicans and the government, they come to a peaceful conclusion. They wanted better living conditions. They got all these concessions and stuff, and the Zapatistas left the towns. All right, so that's basically the history of Latin America. Of course, I kind of skipped over the Aztecs with Montezuma and Cortez. Okay, and I also kind of skipped over Pizarro of the Incas, and he fought. Of Pizarro's conquistadors that fought Atahualpa's Incas. You knew that, right? Yeah, Atahualpa, Incas, Pizarro, conquistadors. So a big fight. All right. So remember, you study that. Good luck tomorrow, and I will see you soon.